Hey, I want to start with this one part. We usually end with this, but I want to start with this. First of all, we'll have links, obviously, to Datacenter Hawk in the comment section below. You guys just are. There's so many groups out there that bring insight and perspective to the marketplace. And I'm not just because I'm a great admirer of yours, trying to amplify this because I'm a fan of you. It's just so true. I hear it in my back office. I hear it in the marketplace. You guys bring such great perspective. So I want to start with this right off the bat. When every year you guys, for years, have done a prediction. Like, what do we predict is going to happen? Is it the current trend? Is there going to be a disruption? And so we're going to link to that episode for 2024. I applaud you for your bravery, because who can predict a darn thing these days? Why not? On the one hand, just jump. On the other hand, we'll base it in science. But what in your 2024, as you talked to your global team, really surprised you? Like you didn't already have a spidey sense of, but really surprised you, or just caught your imagination?
Yeah, I think probably just how large the requirements are starting to become. We've always over the last 5 years. I mean, I think we've seen the growth of the demand, but there's a level of that growth that almost becomes unimaginable, because it almost breaks the way that the data center industry has historically served these requirements. One site at a time, 1 to 2 buildings at a time, and now the requirement sizes from a power perspective, and this is really all across the world. It's happening right now, biggest in the U.S. For certain reasons, but those. I was talking today to our regional director in Europe. She was saying, the sizes of requirements over here are getting larger than we've ever seen, and so we're starting to see that happen. But I think it's just that, and really trying to figure out how will the industry go about serving requirements that are going on sites that are 500 megawatts, 600 megawatts, a gigawatt of power over a 15, 20-year period, whatever the time periods are. It's just, I think that is still shocking to me. When I go to, Northern Virginia is the largest data center market in the world. And it's funny, I probably told Tag this to his face when I've spoken with him there before. I'm like, we talk about data centers all the time, but you go to Loudoun County Parkway and Waxpool Road and you look up, one way and down the other way, and it's still shocking to me at how large these facilities are, how big the industry is becoming.
Right. And that we all now put our logos outside the buildings. We never used to do that, but now we all do. It's we're going to dive into some of the sub parts of that, the power and the other things. But before we do that, one of the things I'd love to tease out of you and see if you guys think about this at all. So up until really just a few years ago, 2, maybe 3 years ago, when we said data center, at least in my world, we basically meant 2 things, either maybe 3. Enterprise, and when I say enterprise, I mean like a Fortune 1000. I'm serving somebody in the Fortune 1000, not the top 10, but somewhere, a big insurance company or a bank or something like that. And they either bought a lot, but they just did it one time, or they buy a little, but they do it all the time. And they would never even take down a data hall. They would take down part of a data hall. They certainly wouldn't take a building. It'd be very unusual in the hosted data center space. Or it was co-location. And by co-location, we just mean that somebody would either on my infrastructure or their infrastructure host their servers, and they would get a bunch of managed services with that backup and remote hands and a bunch of other things to sort of manage the environment, all but the data, the operating systems, all these other things. And that's what we meant for, 2, almost 3 decades. And in the last 3 or 4 years, 3 for sure, the requirements that you're talking about aren't necessarily the explosion in co-location. It's not necessarily the explosion in or enterprise. or even hyperscale. Hyperscale for us was a pretty significant, was a large, they buy a lot and they buy it regularly. Now we've got this whole new thing. I don't even know what to call it. And we talk about it as AI all the time in the industry. Mike, I guess my question before we dive into the AI side of things is, do you see still a demand and growth for the enterprise, the co-location, the not big AI data centers? Are they still growing? Are they still expanding? Is there still, are they looking for emerging markets? Or is it really just because the numbers are so outrageous, just this AI-driven endeavor?
Well, I think those companies are expanding, and they're in a lot of trouble as it relates to the number of options that are out there available for them today. I spoke with a data center operator in April of this year who had told me that they had turned down, over 150 megawatts of enterprise related deal activity. So this might be a 2 megawatt requirement, in this market, or 6 megawatt requirement here, 500 kW here. These are banks, insurance companies, smaller technology companies, these AI, smaller companies that are starting to take larger footprints, and they don't have a lot of options in the market to choose from. Dallas is always a great example of this, because if you looked at the Dallas vacancy rate, the Dallas data center market vacancy rate in 2018, 2019, it was probably 15, 16, 70%, 17%. There was a lot of capacity on the market here. Fast forward 3 years and the vacancy rate here is like 3%, 2%. You had 10 options that had 6 megawatts or higher in the Dallas market in 2020, and by 2023 you've got maybe 2, maybe 1. So the market has shifted quite a bit, but I think the demand side is still there, and those companies now are having to do things. I mean, you brought up a good example, David, about leasing. These companies historically wouldn't lease a data hall. They wouldn't. They'd want to lease a little bit and then ask for more space so they could grow into that over time. And I think now the message for them is, if there's space available today and you can take it, you should, because there's a good chance that in 30 days that space or that power will be reallocated to another user or another interested party. It's not a sales line anymore to say, well, we've got 3 people waiting to lease the space. The data center operators do, and they will. And I think there's a number of enterprise users, well-known banks, well-known insurance companies that have had to learn that lesson. And it's a painful lesson to learn, but that's where the industry is today.
Yeah, that rings true. I remember in our early days, we were primarily brownfield. So we would either convert a building or we would buy an existing data center, modernize it and grow it. And we hate to strand capital. So we would, if it's ultimately going to be, it seems ridiculous to say this now, a 50 megawatt data center. I think I got 50 megawatts on my ashtray out in the parking lot. But a 30 to 50 megawatt data center, we would say to ourselves, do we really want to build out all that UPS? We don't need it for 5 years or 8 years. And so the market developed or approved an appetite for incremental commissioning. If you remember, in the beginning, you could not incrementally commission infrastructure. You had to do it all at once. We hated it because of the cost of things, but everybody came from the colo world or the IT world or the telecom world. So it was accepted. You commission the entire thing. Well, we developed this thing of incrementally commissioning so that we could, I could do 5 megawatt block or whatever it was and grow into it. The economics worked better for everybody. Today, especially since we mostly do greenfield today, we don't incrementally commission it. We just build the thing and we just start filling it up. Our incremental commission is just to stay ahead of the tsunami that's coming behind it. It's not because we've got contracts that are, if this lever gets pulled or that, the levers are pulled. Just get them in. It's like, I just went on a cruise to Alaska, my first ever, and I was like, how do we get 5,000 people on this boat? They basically, the first 100 get on elegantly, the rest they just push you on. But is that your experience too, that it is, it's not a land rush. I don't mean that. I mean, people are looking at 3 to 5 years. They see the need one way or the other, and they're just making the investment now and buying off on it because they're just, it's more than likely somebody else is going to occupy that space if they don't.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, one of the questions that I get frequently is, are people just kind of buying the space to take it and maybe don't have great intentions for it now, but might down the road? And I think about that on like the grand scale. Our industry, and for those listening, if you're not aware, there's maybe 5 to 10 large users at the largest levels that are doing most of the leasing and the activity in the space right now. And I think there's some thoughts always around them on like going, hey, do they have the immediate need for that, or is this a defensive position? Hey, we know that the data center power available for data center growth in the next 3 to 5 years is going to be very scarce. Therefore, even though we don't exactly know what our needs might be, we need to go take that. Maybe some, but given the conversations that we've had with some of those end users, and then kind of just the thought in the market is that the prediction around at the larger levels, again, these are the AI companies, but the prediction around the amount of capacity they will need, just one of those users is significant for the U.S.
Yeah.
And then you take that to 4 or 5 of them, and it's almost the current grid across the U.S. cannot serve those users without additional investment, not just in the transmission, but probably the generation side as well. And the enterprise user that we talked about before, it's a different problem to solve.
Right.
They don't have a lot of homes, so they're either going to have to move faster, get more comfortable with cloud, or determine, if this sounds crazy to say, but that they would want to try to do something themselves.
Yeah.
We've seen the industry go the exact opposite, which has been, hey, we're either going to get off of our, out of our on-prem data center solutions and get into co-location or cloud or managed services. But those options are more limited today. So it's pushing these enterprise users differently than they've been maybe challenged in the past as it relates to housing their IT infrastructure requirements.
Don't judge me, but I used to be an IT guy at the University of Texas, hook 'em horns. Now they've welcomed to the real college football conference in the SEC. I'm just teasing.
We'll see how it goes.
We'll see how it goes. Well, and some of their historic rivals are in there, and so we get to see some of these great games again. But in all seriousness, and this is completely unscientific, it's just old colleagues talking to each other. But when you raise the on-prem conversation, it has come up again. They're like, look, we're thinking about doing some of this ourselves again, and or even expanding it, and halting momentum to move either to cloud or to a local co-location provider. Yeah. And I was like, why? Why would you do that? And they said, look, there's all the problems that we described, but also they said there is an abundance of people. One of the problems that they had before was, how do I get people that want to come work at a university to maintain infrastructure? Well, there's a lot of Class B and other warehouse and office space people that aren't necessarily data center people, but they are not growing. They are, I don't want to say they're collapsing. I'm not a real estate expert over there, but they are definitely not growing. And so they're looking for, how do I get in? And here's an opportunity for me to join where before there was a scarcity and it was a vulnerability. So it's like this opportunity is coming together, and they're giving it serious consideration.
Yeah, and I think that trend will continue. I mean, we will see people, and that in some ways that's a good thing for our space, because we have labor issues and challenges. I just read something that that Andrew Schaap put out, who's the CEO of Align Data Centers, a really well-known data center operator. And, his comment was, or the article was around, basically, our space is growing so much, but we're having issues getting people to work in this industry, and he said, here's why, and here's how we need to change that. So it's a great thing that we are getting interest in this market, because I don't think any of us see it, slowing down anytime soon. So it's just going to continue to grow. And you've got a lot of talented people that come from the office, the industrial, the multi-family, commercial real estate, data center asset classes, which are not performing, like the data center market is. If you look at vacancy rates across major markets in the US in the office market, it's, in the 20 to 25% range average. Industrial, it's in like the 8 to 10% range. The data center market, according to Datacenter Hawk, is like 0.9% vacant. So it's no secret why
Right.
people are looking at our space going, hey, there's something happening here that was not going on 10 years ago, was not even going on 5 years ago. And it's going to keep going on until either we solve the power issue,
Right.
or the requirement sizes go away. And both of those things seem a long way off.
Yeah, I would agree. Man, I would stay on this and go down a whole rabbit hole, but I want to change.
Sure.
Let's come back to power for a second. Couple places I want to start with, but there are a number of numbers that have been thrown around, and without speculating about them too much, I guess my question to you is, as you do your research, do you guys have a number in mind that you think North America, U.S., Canada, whatever, maybe just we stick with the States, there's a number that we can get to in the next 10 years, whatever the federal government says, the public utilities say, whatever, basically that says, look, we have on the books with all the investment, with all of the engagement, we think we can do two things: refresh the aging fleet, whatever it might be, and build new infrastructure, and whether that's generation, transmission, or distribution. Before we get into the microgrid or self-gen conversation, do you have a number in your mind? And by the way, one of the things that I find myself doing all the time is I just think about it from a data center point of view. I don't think about it from a military. I don't think about it from a state government, like at an airport or whatever. I mean, we have conversations where we consume as much power as, the airport and the military in this state and probably others. And is there a number that's been kicked around out there that you're familiar with, or is it still we're not sure?
Yeah, it's a great question. If you look at demand, the way demand has been like signed for, and I'm just talking about the leasing that's taken place. These are things that
Right.
QTS and Compass and Digital Realty and all these bigger
Right.
companies do. Last year in the U.S. alone, Datacenter Hawk, we tracked 4 gigawatts of like leasing absorption.
Mm-hmm.
The year before that, we were in the 2 range. The year before that, we were in the low 1s, or like I think 800 megawatts. So there's this, I always say, all these things are talked about at conferences and these buzzwords in our space. We started talking about AI, a while ago. We are seeing the hockey stick of demand from, I believe, this technology.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, then you look at the self-build projects that are out there by these large users, and you could double that. So let's say 8 gigawatts of capacity last year,
Right.
in the U.S.
Right.
Maybe we run that out 5 years, 6 years before the grid can't take the additional, capacity unless there's additional generation, transmission, and distribution to get to that. And that stuff's going on now. I don't want to, if people are listening and they're like, hey, there's this project going on.
Right.
I know that.
Right.
But I'm just stating that there has to be additional, like significant investment in the grid across the country for this to work long term, or it goes, potentially somewhere else. And I think one of the reasons it's landing in the US right now is because you've got a more business friendly environment with less regulations.
Mm-hmm.
And there's still pockets of power, significant power in the US that can handle some of these, requirements that really, to the size that we're seeing in the US, that Europe, the European region might not be large enough or have the grid to handle right now.
Right.
But at some point, this is going to break. The other thing I was going to say, yesterday we saw one of the power companies come out and communicate a rate increase to their users that's pretty significant. I think it was like 20 to 30% over the next year or two or something like that. And it's related to the investment that they're making in the grid to solve, not just data centers, but
Right.
the additional power investments that they're making.
Yeah.
And I started to think, the data center industry is so critical to the world's success. But it's also starting to move really into like the crosshairs of the political world
Hmm.
and how people feel about, well, it's great that everybody has social media and X, Y, and Z, but do I really want to pay 30% more on my electricity?
Right.
No, I'd just rather be, a couple social networks less and keep my, electric bill. And again, that's a very like
Sure.
simplistic talking point, but my point is that we've got some things that are starting to happen that could shift the way the world looks at our industry. And so it's on us to really educate, think through how you include both the, sustainability side and the community side in the data center development moving forward.
I completely agree. The one of the conversations before we get back to some of the power and the infrastructure stuff is this relational conversation that we have to have. And we have to do it in a way, we have to get better at recognizing when you're a business and you come to a marketplace and say, hey, we're here for altruistic reasons, there's a level of skepticism. And so you need to show up with facts. You need to show up with, you need to be well-informed. You need to be open-minded with the community. That's a frequent topic of conversation around our halls, not just how we build and operate things safely and efficiently, but how do we interact with the community? And one of the things, early days, I've heard Lawson Shanks over at Aligned and others talk about this too. If we're lazy, we'll allow the conversation to go the way that it many times does when it gets in the crosshairs, which is, well, we can do less social media, or we can. Do you let your kids have a cell phone when they're at an athletic event, where they travel, they're 17, 18 years old, and they're driving to places? Do you want to know where they are and they can reach you at any? Of course you do. Or do you want to go into the bank, or do you want to have access to your bank on your phone? Like, here's all the ways that we use this technology that's not, it's not just friends and family and kind of fun. It's serious.
Yep.
There's safety. There's
Yep.
efficiency. All of these other things. I was just visiting some friends in Seattle, and he was showing me from his cloud recording. I was like, why do you save all your camera stuff to the cloud? He said, look at this. There's a black bear walking through their backyard. I was like, that's a problem. I don't know who has a neighborhood that still has. You know why we don't have those in the South? He said, I don't think you had bears in the South. Well, we used to, but we have a bunch of rednecks, and they see a bear and they eat the bear.
That's right.
It's not going to happen. But my point is that if we, I don't disagree that we shouldn't create more data that's just junk, that just clouds the fiber connections and consumes all these other things. We should be using these tools for human flourishing. But it is the economy. I used to say it's the modern economy, and Tag, who we were talking about before, kind of chastised me. He said, Dave, it's just the economy. Like, if you're not connected to digital infrastructure, you're not
Yep.
connected to the economy. And if you're not connected to the economy, unless you're retired because you've already been connected to the economy, you can't either maintain or lift your family, your tribe, your village, or
Yeah.
whatever out of poverty. And so it's not going to slow down. There are plenty of places in the world that would love to grow their infrastructure if we slow down
Yeah.
our infrastructure and take over leadership positions of the world. But it doesn't discount then the conversation that I think that you're alluding to, which is, look, we need to, when we build these things, we need to do them in a sustainable, we need to do them in an efficient way. But I'm curious about, so if we just run the numbers out, let's just and I know this is not scientific, but 8 gigawatts, 5 years, that's 40 gigawatts. I've heard a little less, I've heard more, but that's just our industry. So if we imagine 50 or 60 gigawatts over the next 5 years for the quote unquote grid or grids across North America, I'm wondering, when I listen to Christine King of Idaho National Lab, she's with the Nuclear Gain Program out there, or some of these others, they're like, look, there are plants that are being decommissioned, not just nuclear, just plants, energy generation that are scheduled for decommission because they're end of life. We're trying to replace or rebuild those. We're trying to modernize our transmission. We're trying to build new right-of-ways, which are at least as hard as building new generation plants. And just like everybody else, there's a resource challenge. There's a labor challenge. There's all these other challenges. And I have yet to hear a number, but the grid at 60 gigawatts, let's say, in 5 years, or 80, or whatever the number is, there's just not a lot of room. I don't know if anybody knows that, but it's definitely a conversation piece. And I'm curious what opportunities it might create, either for self-generation or moving to other places where they don't have the same, where they have the same challenge.
Yeah, and I think the good news about the numbers that you're talking about is it's going to force power companies to invest in the grid, speculatively in a way that they haven't. So much of specifically the U.S., so much of the U.S. grid investment has been like maintenance and over time, just because of the lower growth rates. It would be hard for them to go, hey, we're going to spend $10 billion on this infrastructure project when their growth rates are so low. So now at least there is the evidence and the data that suggests this high growth rate. So there needs to be significant investment made in the grid. And I do think that's a good thing for our country as a whole, really North America as a whole moving forward. Where it goes, if we get to that point, I think there's some areas in Latin America that are starting to position themselves as logical landing places for some of these larger requirements. There are areas down in Latin America that have, more power and kind of like an excess of power that maybe some other areas, certainly in the U.S., don't have. I think there's, one thing that's always good to remember is that if you solve the power problem, that's good, but you might create other problems. It could be, well, now we've got a connectivity issue. Now we have a tax incentive issue. Now we have just a mature market issue. Like, do I feel comfortable as a business investing $5 billion of our money in this market when we're not sure the political stability? We're not sure. So there's these are real issues that companies start asking themselves as they think about investing different places internationally. And the data center industry isn't the first industry to have to deal with that. But at this capital investment level, it's pretty unique. Yeah. Because this is not, we're putting a strategic small office in this international market we've never been before. Right. This is, if we want to go put something in this market, it's going to be $2 billion. Right. And that's our minimum investment if we go here, and I think that's that's not something that all companies have had to deal with.
It's not insignificant. There's a level of sophistication around that. One of the things that I think is very fortunate, I wish I could say that organizations like ours could have predicted it, but it was just a fortunate circumstance. When you come out of the co-location world, which was primarily an IT service world, you have to learn how to balance in that world compute, network, and storage. If you've got a strong compute team and all you're focused on is the IT compute, but you don't give enough conversation or be collaborative enough with storage or network, you break the whole thing, right? It's all of those things. And so you develop sophistication around the conversations and how do we balance these things, and introverted engineers talking to each other, and then the business models that work. But it had to be developed. It's regularly developed, came from the virtual machines and building out all of that infrastructure. And so those that have spent time with that, they recognize that as we grow in data centers, it's the same balancing act, whether it's power or it's the business environment or it's connectivity or these other things. Any of these 4 or 5 things can stop us, can break the model. So how do we maintain that? I'm curious, as we think about this right now, before we expand to any other country, we will certainly be chasing the pockets of opportunity that have all of these things, the right combination of these things that we're talking about. Access to power, of course, is the primary, but it's also the business environments. And we see some environments that had all of those things, whether they're running out of power or their political environment is changing or whatever. And then we see other markets that are raising their hands saying, hey, you haven't looked at us before, but we're very eager to be part of this. Are there areas that you that you guys are aware of in North America that you've published? This, I don't want any secret,
Yeah, sure.
obviously any secret sauce, but some of these things as you talk amongst yourselves that are kind of curious and interesting and cool to see emerging. Just don't mention either Davenport, Iowa. I have a thing against them because I had to spend many Thanksgivings there, and fertilizing season is during Thanksgiving, and you don't want your Thanksgiving turkey to taste like fertilizer. Or Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tulsa, Oklahoma, I've bumped into a couple of those people, and they're way too arrogant for their modest town. Besides those, are there places that you guys are aware of that are like, wow, this is really cool, and this is unexpected to see people evaluating these marketplaces to move to?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of maybe pass on that. One would be, pay attention to the secondary sites and primary markets. And this is like the moving of the submarkets in the major markets. I'll give you a couple examples. Phoenix, it would be, we're starting to move to like Mesa on the east side or Goodyear, and then moving on from those, north and south of each one of those. That's really interesting. In Dallas, all the activity right now is happening in South Dallas. And if you told me 10 years ago that that's where the data center activity in this market would happen, I would have lost all my money. I mean, it was all industrial development down, south of the Dallas area. In Chicago, it's really moving west and now moving somewhat, north. So that's one thing I would pay attention to, because back to the conversation that Jonathan Schildkraut and I had that you were referencing at the beginning of our conversation. He mentioned this kind of wave of inference requirements that would have the potential necessity to need to be closer to major markets.
Sure.
And those could, fill those areas, no problem. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I would almost call them like tier 2 markets that historically haven't received as much interest than they are now. Reno, Nevada is a good example of one. The Charlotte area, Charlotte and Raleigh is another good example on the East Coast. We're seeing a lot of activity right now in Indiana, like Indianapolis, kind of around that area. So I think there's places like that historically, if you've been in the data center space now for, it's unbelievable, but like 18 years,
right?
You go, I never would have anticipated some of those areas, seeing the demand size that they are. And then the third thing I would say to this question would be, then you look at like the more rural environments that you just, it is, hey, there's a pocket of power here that can be capitalized on and, sold to an end user that's really valuable. There's areas in Pennsylvania, in Ohio. I mean, a lot of it we're seeing in the kind of like central part of the country, certainly in different areas, I guess, in like the Colorado, Wyoming area is really interesting on some larger pockets of power. So, but like I said, you might solve the power issue, but you might have a labor challenge. The more rural the markets get, the harder it is to get the labor there.
Right.
One of the advantages of our growing industry in certain areas has been, if you're trying to build in the Northern Virginia market and you have a significant amount of electricians there or the trades that are there, they can kind of be in that general area and serve many different, users. If you're out in the middle of North Dakota, there's certainly labor there, but it's more of a challenge to get significant amount of people there to work on different projects.
Yeah, and I also think we lived when I was a kid in North Dakota, and what I found is when we talk to people about moving to some of these other areas, it just depends. One of the first questions we're learning is, if in the wintertime I walk past a piece of metal and I stick to it, that's a little too cold. That's not high on their bucket list, I would say.
Sure.
But what's cool, and again, not scientific, but as we've looked at some of the marketplaces that we may or may not have talked about today, there is a lot of people that are interested in moving out of some of the really heavy populated areas and would say, hey, look, you're giving me an opportunity to move to some of these other areas that I would love to, but I just didn't think there was the employment opportunities to maintain for myself and for my family, and now those are. I think we need to get the message out that these are opportunities and people are interested in them. Unscientific, we'll see, but back in the day or days, You could see the growth of infrastructure. It would follow the rivers. It would follow the waterways, the lakes, or whatever, because I've got to move whatever my product is. Then we built railroads, and so things came off of the railroads and then the interstates. And Jonathan and many others have talked about, look, it's obvious now. Microsoft, one of their engineers, posted something. You look at these big fiber routes that have been built, the arteries that have built from a digital world. And, people have been writing this, but we just didn't pay that close attention to it decades ago. Like, nobody's going to build in why would I build in Denver when I could build in Dallas? Why would I do a Salt Lake City or Reno when I could do a Vegas-like switch or the Bay Area or whatever? But now as those primary areas, or the original areas, I don't even want to say primary, the original areas, the Detroits, the Chicagos, the whatever back in the turn of the century manufacturing days, when those harbors got full, they moved to secondary markets, which then became primary markets, Cleveland, Buffalo, or whatever, because they had access to these pipelines. We'll see that, I think, more and more. And eventually, I don't know how far down the road, but everywhere is going to, the data center world, small to large, is just going to be an interconnected web of, because it is the economy. It's how we're going to do all the things that we do.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the industry geographically is changing significantly, and that's not going to stop because these problems can't fix themselves fast enough. And it's one of the reasons that this space is so exciting. If this was the office market and it was seeing all the demand that was here, in 18 months, it would be oversupplied. You'd have all these developers come in, they'd build buildings, and you go, okay, now the rates would come down, the rental rates would come down. That right now, can't happen. Now, there's challenges in the data center industry right now. I mean, and ones that, the industry is really going to have to figure out. I mean, a lot of like the legislation around AI, how the world feels about, the power growth that's happening, and the industry's ability to educate, to your point earlier, on, the pluses of the digital infrastructure world growing, and the benefits to the life, to people's lives that it actually creates. I mean, that's a challenge for the data center industry right now, and one I think that all of us collectively could say, hey, we haven't probably done the best job at that, and we've got to do a better job communicating and helping people understand what this industry is and how they can be a part of it, and why it's important. So there's definitely challenges ahead, but the friction right now in the space, the tension is creating a lot of opportunities in a lot of different parts of our space. And it's one of these industries that if there was ever a time to get in, it's now.
How has your organization expanded its scope of the pieces of information they bring to the marketplace? And two, I want to talk about the seductive attractiveness of self-generation. Which of those you want to tackle first?
So the alternative energy solutions that are out there today, and how people are trying to solve them, is worth paying attention to and worth watching and trying to understand. Self-admittedly, I'm not a power expert. Probably not hard to figure that out on this call, but I think that the self-generation and being able to almost like bridge the gap temporarily while some of these longer term solutions are being put in place is a focus of really like all major data center operators and the large end users that are out there today. They're spending, hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe even billions, like researching this and really trying to understand how do you solve that problem. I don't see a clear, again, this is where I sit, but I don't see a clear answer to the problem just yet. I think with each one of these alternative energy solutions, you can, there's 3 benefits and probably 3 disadvantages to each one.
Right.
And some of it has to do with the cost to implement. Some of it has to do with how long it takes to put these solutions in play. Some of it has to do with getting the communities or like getting this approved, like these energy solutions approved on, site. So I think the verdict is still out on this. I was at a conference in DC a few months ago, and I actually sat down with someone that is financing these type of projects. And I quickly realized I wanted to be a learner and just started asking a bunch of questions. And I said, hey, how would you solve this problem in the US, the issue that we have moving forward?
Right.
Um, and the person said, natural gas. He
Right.
goes, that is the thing in the US that we have an abundant amount of. It's, we've kind of convinced ourselves it's the cleanest,
Right.
fossil fuel.
Right.
But it's not something yet that the industry is willing really to embrace. And there's still questions around how much you can actually, how quickly you can, use that energy and how quickly those companies will get on board. But I thought that was a really interesting comment. And I don't have, my opinion, I don't have one that makes the most sense to me right now, but it's very clear that these are all being evaluated by, the top data center operators and users in the space.
It's come up so often. I was interviewing Alan Meeks not long ago. He is the CEO of Mox Networks. They're focused on healthcare fiber infrastructure. Really smart guy. Half of our conversation was about self-generation and natural gas and natural gas turbines. And why I'm talking about that, it just seems like it's coming up, whether it's in the data center industry or the adjacent data center industry. How do we solve, especially in America, we tend to have this entrepreneurial risk-taking spirit where I remember talking to a futurist in Switzerland. He said, one of the things that I admired, was in the States for a number of years, a couple decades, and it always surprised me, the willingness for people to come together and say, let's go do an adventure. We don't want to fail, but it's a possibility. He said, where I'm from in Germany and Switzerland, that is an unlikely scenario in the IT space and the software development space that he talked about. And this conversation over the last year, I've talked to the guys over at Volt Energy. We've talked to a couple others that are in this space. They build the microgrid. They bring the turbine. And one of the things that it's expanded is, look, if you bring a couple data center operators together, kind of in not a co-op, but they're all sort of part of this large project, and then also have the ability to build extra capacity so you're serving the community. You're not just serving yourself. In those places where it makes sense, where you can get access to the gas, or whatever. It doesn't have to be natural gas. There are 2 or 3 different energy forms that you could do this with. And they saw it as a stepping stone to, the code to paradise, which is SMRs, as everybody talks about at some distant point in the future. But whatever it is, if we want to continue to grow and we don't want to be vulnerable to a lack of energy, like this might be a viable solution. I've yet to see any of that play out, but it is a conversation that I'm hearing, not just amongst the biggest operators, but all of these adjacent people, pro or con, are talking about it. And it just wasn't a thing that was talked about very much as recently as a year ago.
Yeah, it's definitely the new, if you analyze the conversations that people in our industry have, I mean, these are the ones that are being, to your point, talked about all the time now. Like we used to talk about the edge and,
right.
Self-driving cars and all these different things. This is definitely taking a majority of the, conversational topics that are out there today in our industry.
Right. So let's talk about Datacenter Hawk. Where have you guys, you started off, what were the core competencies that you guys brought to the table, and what have you been adding to that over the years as the industry has grown in its requirements?
Yeah, it's a great question. First, there's a funny story. When I was the industry's changed significantly, the way it evaluates like options, where a data center operator would buy land, where a data center user would put their capacity. There was a lot of site selection criteria and work that we used to do 10, 15, 20 years ago that the stringency around that has loosened quite a bit. I'll give you a good example. When I was at CBRE, this is probably 15 years ago, it was some sort of a site selection project, and it was in, I think, the Dallas area, and the user wanted to be outside of a 5 mile radius of any type of like major or regional airport.
Right.
So I took a map and kind of drew these, 5 mile like these circles around, the metroplex, and it was like there was nowhere he could go. There was no land that fit that criteria. And used to hear like flight paths and not near natural gas. I would say like we used to build, you couldn't be within a natural gas or nuclear site, and now we're buying them.
Right. That's right.
So, it's like it's totally shifted. At Datacenter Hawk, when we started, we were really tracking the availability data center by data center and the planned growth at different colocation operators across the U.S. That's what we started. 10 markets in the U.S. This was 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think what we found was, number one, we had to start tracking like planned sites. So these are sites that growth could take place. So sites that data center operators had purchased where they could grow in the future. And, up until about 2020, 2021, these historically were like another 36 megawatts can be delivered on this site, another 50 megawatts here. Now that number has, shifted dramatically, and the markets have shifted. So we added international, capabilities to our platform. So now we have a team in Europe, APAC, Latin America that are out there running the same thing that we've done in the US, and it's been really fun and successful to watch. We've added additional data sets, so around things like power plants, substations, transmission lines, fiber lines. So really this is a holistic solution that has to be figured out to solve these applications, like the geography of where they need to go. So we've tried to like wrap the basic offering with the additional data components that end users or data center operators and investors need today to make the fastest decisions possible. Because if you want to go, be an expert in some of these data sets, it just takes a lot of time, energy, and effort to do. You can do it yourself.
Right.
You can like hire a team to do it internally.
Right.
You can use some of these other data platforms that are, just more broad. Or, our service was really designed by people that have been in the space before to really try to get to the answer as fast as possible. And so that's how we've done it, with more data sets, more markets. And I think moving forward, we're really trying to pay attention to where the market's going to be in 5 to 10 years to make sure that we have that information that can help get us there.
Yeah. Is any particular market, like is North America easier to find those data sets than, you don't have to name other markets, but are some markets lend themselves to more easily accessible information?
Yes, certainly. I mean, there's from a couple of things. One would just be like the business maturity in the market. I think by region, North America and the way that, really the US, like the states operate with, different similar, like a federal laws and regulations, but also state laws and regulations. And many of those are different, but many of those are similar too. So there's because of that, you can gather data a little bit more easily than some other regions that are country by country and are, they're different languages, they're different currencies, they're different governments. And so when you have all that you have to deal with to figure out how to get data and then make it apples to apples for customers, that can be a challenge. But I think it's getting, better, because our business is globalizing, faster than many of us can keep up with. That is pushing for more maturity in the data. And so that's certainly helping, but it's not easy, and it's great. It's why we exist. And we love the challenge and, love the opportunity to go out, understand what's happening in the market, internalize it here, and push it back out to our customers and people that are in the space. And it's really fun. I mean, we get, one of our APAC team members went to a conference in Hong Kong. This is, I think, last year, and was introducing himself to someone. And I think the person said, like, the only thing I know about Datacenter Hawk is there's 2 guys on a podcast in the US that talk about the data center market, and so it's just a great example of how our industry is really spread out across the world, and there's, tremendous opportunities, I think, for all of us moving forward.
Poor Red is sitting there and they wouldn't even know their faces if it wasn't for me. And they'd probably
he should get all the credit, and he gets none.
I think he should figure out how to do one of these skins that people, because I think you'd look great in like a Fletch fro from, and you guys have no idea. He just throws random stuff out there. Well, look, I love talking to you, and I love that you've carved off some of your time. It just seems like you guys are everywhere. We've always, as I said at the beginning of the program, your information is always so compelling, accurate. I think it's super important. Even with those groups that have an internal team, I know that they, and this is not a plug for Datacenter Hawk, I just can't help doing it. They at least use you to confirm something, to make sure we don't have a bias, right? Yeah. There are some areas that operators have a lot of sophistication in, and we don't need a primary help, but there are times we need a sanity check, because we are all moving at such a speed and such a scale, and especially as we're moving into markets, whether they're North America or out, that we're just, we're not sophisticated in Brazil, we're not sophisticated in Europe, or, pick a whatever. And it just seems like every time I turn around, I see another LinkedIn thing where you guys are going somewhere fun. And I'm like, what is going on with those guys? They're having a good time. So I appreciate you making some time, and I wish much success for you guys. I hope it continues.
Well, thanks, Dave, and always appreciate the opportunity to catch up with you. And, we obviously think highly of the QTS team and what you all are doing, and look forward to the future. I mean, this is... it's a really exciting space, and can't wait to see where it goes down the road.
I agree. Hey, everybody, if you enjoyed the conversation, like it. And if you loved it, subscribe. Make sure you check out the Datacenter Hawk links that we have below. Thanks for joining us. Have a good one.